Our hearts are constantly sending out signals, tiny little messages that are carried all through our bloodstream. And most of the time, they're just telling a story of good health. But every now and then, they send out a critical alarm. So today, we're going to decode the story of how science finally learned to listen in on these vital messages. Okay, picture this scene. It happens in emergency rooms literally every single day. A patient comes in and their symptoms are just screaming heart attack. That crushing chest pain, shortness of breath, maybe that classic pain shooting down their arm. The stakes could not be higher, and the doctors, well, they need an answer and they need it fast. And get this, the answer. The key piece of evidence in this whole medical detective story isn't found on the outside. It's hidden deep inside the patient, in just a few drops of their blood. So let's dive right into it. We've got a mystery in the chest. How in the world do you tell the difference between a life-threatening heart attack and, a dozen other things that have really similar symptoms? Well, you start looking for clues. And this is really where our whole story begins. Doctors start hunting for something called cardiac biomarkers. Now, the easiest way to think of these is as molecular distress signals. When your heart muscle gets damaged or it's under some serious stress, it starts to leak these very specific substances into your bloodstream. Finding them is just like a detective finding a clue left behind at a crime scene. But here's the thing. Finding the right clue, that took decades of work. The first attempts, honestly, were a bit like using a magnifying glass when what you really needed was a high-powered microscope. They were pretty crude, but hey, you gotta start somewhere, right? This whole investigation really kicked off way back in 1954 with a biomarker called AST, but it was a faulty lead from the start. Then, through the 60s and 70s, we got others like LDH and CK, a little better, but still not specific enough to the heart. It wasn't until the 1980s that a test called CKMB became the standard. It was definitely an improvement, but it still wasn't that crystal clear piece of evidence that doctors were so desperate for. The real problem, the core issue, was something called specificity. You see, these early markers, they were just really unreliable witnesses. Their signals were all tangled up. They could be coming from skeletal muscle, from the liver, all sorts of places. So an elevated level might mean a heart attack, or it could just mean you had a really tough workout. This led to so many false alarms. What doctors needed was the ideal clue, a signal that came only from the heart. And then they found it. This was the massive breakthrough, the turning point in the whole investigation that just changed everything for cardiology. This was the moment they found the smoking gun. And that game changer, the hero of our story, has a name: troponin. It's a regulatory protein that, as it turns out, is the perfect informant for exactly what's happening inside the heart.
So here's what makes troponin so special. There are these specific forms of it called T and I that are found only in heart muscle, nowhere else. So when heart cells get damaged and die, like they do during a heart attack, this unique troponin leaks out. It's literally the molecular fingerprint of a cardiac injury, the perfect eyewitness. And having that precision, it's life-changing. It means doctors can act way faster to save heart muscle, turning what could be a devastating event into something manageable.
This discovery was so profound, so important, that today, all the major cardiology guidelines, from organizations like the American Heart Association, the European Society of Cardiology, you name it, they all consider measuring cardiac troponin to be mandatory and fundamental. It's not just some option, it is the undisputed gold standard. So just how accepted is it? Well, a survey of over 1,900 medical centers in 23 different countries found that a staggering 96% of them use cardiac troponin as their #1 tool for diagnosing a heart attack. It's basically become the universal language for this diagnosis. But wait, our detective story isn't quite over. Because you see, not all heart problems are that sudden, acute kind of attack. Sometimes the heart is sending out a completely different kind of distress signal, one that points to a much more chronic problem. These issues aren't about a sudden blockage that causes cells to die. No, this is about long-term stress, constant pressure, and the heart just struggling to keep up with its day-to-day job. This is the world of heart failure.
Heart failure is a really complex and widespread syndrome. It affects millions of people. And what it boils down to is that the heart muscle just can't pump blood as efficiently as it needs to. This leads to a buildup of pressure, fluid, and those classic symptoms like fatigue and what doctors call dyspnea, which is really just shortness of breath. This condition needed a completely different kind of clue. And doctors found it. They found it in a hormone called BNP. You see, when the heart's chambers, the ventricles, are being stretched and strained by all that high pressure from heart failure, they release BNP into the blood. So think of it this way. Troponin is a sign of injury, but high levels of BNP, that's a clear signal of stress and pressure.
Okay, so let's bring it all together. With these incredibly specific clues in hand, the modern doctor now has this amazing diagnostic toolkit to solve these mysteries of the chest. The approach today is so clear and streamlined. A patient comes in. Is it chest pain that sounds like a heart attack? You measure troponin. Is it shortness of breath that sounds more like heart failure? You measure BNP. And what about all those old clues from the 50s, 60s, and 70s? Well, they're basically obsolete now, no longer considered medically necessary for these specific diagnoses. So if there's one major takeaway from all of this, it's this. We finally have the right tool for the right job. For that acute crisis of a heart attack, troponin tells us yes or no, has heart muscle been damaged? And for the chronic strain of heart failure, BNP tells us the heart is under dangerous stress. Two very different problems and two distinct, incredibly powerful clues. You know, it's just amazing to think how far we've come from those first crude clues to these unbelievably precise molecular fingerprints. But of course, science never stops. The next generation of high-sensitivity tests are already rolling out, and they can detect even smaller amounts of these biomarkers. Which leads to one final thought. As our ability to listen gets even more refined, what new stories, what new secrets will our hearts begin to tell us?